Warning: this story contains mature themes and may be disturbing to some viewers. 1991. In the vast, sun-baked heart of the African bush, a skilled conservation pilot vanished without a trace during a routine patrol. For decades, David Sterling's disappearance remained a cold case, a tragic accident etched into the memories of those who loved him. Presumed lost forever to the unforgiving wilderness he sought to protect. He wouldn't just leave, his wife whispered through tears, a sentiment echoed by many who knew his dedication. But the bush holds its secrets tight. Until a recent, unexpected discovery, a damaged, partially buried radio transceiver far off any known flight path, sent a shiver through the quiet assumptions, suggesting something far more sinister than a simple crash. It hints at a hidden truth waiting in the silence, a truth that could rewrite David's fate entirely. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe the truth always finds a way to surface. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the acacia trees, painting the endless savanna in hues of gold and molten bronze, as David banked the Cessna, the familiar drone of the engine, a comforting counterpoint to the wild symphony below. This was his domain, the sky over the Zambezi Valley, a place he loved with an intensity that sometimes surprised even himself, a place of breathtaking beauty and simmering danger. Below, elephants moved like slow, gray shadows, and the sinewy Zambezi River snaked its way eastward, a lifeline in the vast landscape. He adjusted the controls, feeling the subtle shifts of air beneath the wings, an extension of his own body after countless hours aloft. His idealism, a burning conviction that this fragile ecosystem was worth fighting for, fueled every patrol, every tip-off he chased, every risky landing on remote dirt strips. He was a guardian of this wild heart, a counterpoint to the unseen forces, poachers with their brutal traps and rifles, corrupt officials turning a blind eye for profit that threatened to rip it apart. A sudden gust buffeted the plane, pulling his attention back to the present. He thought of Sarah, her warm smile, the way she'd packed his favorite thermos that morning, her quiet worry etched around her eyes. He thought of the children, their laughter ringing in his ears. That love, that promise of returning home, was the tether that bound him to the ground, a sharp, poignant ache that intensified the loneliness of the sky. He scanned the horizon again, his gaze sweeping across the familiar landmarks, the lone copy, the distant shimmer of water, the dark line of the border, searching for any sign of disturbance, any telltale track or plume of smoke. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. The reports had been increasing, more brazen incursions, rumors of sophisticated operations pushing deeper into protected zones. He felt a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the wind slicing through the open cockpit window. Something felt off, the usual rhythm of the bush disturbed. Just then, a flicker of movement caught his eye far below, near the riverbank, too fast, too deliberate to be wildlife. He circled slowly, dipping a wing, his heart rate accelerating. It looked like vehicles where no vehicles should be. As he closed in, the glint of something metallic, dangerously like the barrel of a weapon aimed skyward, solidified his dread. The peaceful scene shattered, replaced by the stark, cold reality of the conflict he was immersed in. His hand tightened on the yoke, adrenaline flooding his system. He needed to see, to identify, to report. He pushed the nose down slightly, descending into the trap he hadn't realized was being set. The familiar hum of the engine seemed to take on a new, ominous tone. Captain Anya Sharma had flown this route 100 times. Her mission today was standard, a low-altitude survey of the vast protected wilderness bordering the state line, checking for signs of illegal logging or poaching. The morning sun warmed the cockpit, casting long shadows over the endless green canopy below. The Cessna single engine hummed a familiar, comforting rhythm against the occasional buffet of the wind. Below, deer scattered as her shadow passed. A routine ballet she knew well. She thought of the small cabin she was saving for, nestled deep in the woods, picturing the quiet evenings reading by firelight, a stark contrast to the solitude of the sky, yet a solitude she equally cherished. Just another day, another patrol. The airwaves crackled softly with distant chatter from other pilots, a gentle reminder she wasn't truly alone. Then, the radio went silent. Not just quiet, but dead. She tried her primary frequency. Nothing. Switched to emergency. Only static, sharp and sudden, like ripping paper. Back at regional control, the controller's voice, momentarily cheerful, asking for her position update, hung unanswered on the frequency. Confusion rippled through the tower. Foxtrot Alpha 9 or 7, confirm last transmission? Silence. A second call, laced with a hint of urgency this time. More silence. On the ground, the park ranger team monitoring her progress saw her track hold frozen on their screen, then vanish. A cold dread began to spread, thick and fast, replacing the morning's easy calm. Anya, miles above the trees, felt a sudden, jarring lurch, not of turbulence, but something internal, like a cold hand squeezing her gut. She scanned her instruments. Readings flickered erratically. Then some simply died. The hum of the engine seemed to falter, a subtle, horrifying stutter that promised swift, brutal finality. Her knuckles tightened on the yoke, eyes darting between the unresponsive radio and the increasingly erratic gauges. This wasn't a comms glitch. This was real. Above her, the clear blue sky suddenly seemed immense, indifferent, and terrifyingly empty. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The phone call came, a sharp intrusion into the mundane afternoon, carrying words that splintered reality. Missing, overdue, signal lost. Instantly, the world constricted for the pilot's family, shrinking from sunlit rooms and laughter to a suffocating knot of disbelief. Denial was a flimsy shield against the cold certainty creeping in. Not him, he was the best. Frantic calls were made, voices tight with a terror they couldn't yet name. The initial search efforts were a reflection of this raw panic, a chaotic outpouring of energy against an indifferent landscape. Helicopters beat the air, their rotors a desperate pulse over miles of unforgiving mountain peaks and deep, shadowed ravines. Ground teams, a mix of seasoned SAR volunteers and hopeful, untrained locals, fanned out, battling dense undergrowth and the deceptive scale of the wilderness. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, triggered a surge of adrenaline, a flicker of false hope quickly extinguished. The sheer vastness of the terrain became the primary antagonist, swallowing signals, hiding traces, making a simple flyover feel like peering into an ocean. As hours bled into days, the organized response began to solidify, albeit with inherent limitations. Local sheriff's departments coordinated resources, but budget constraints and the sheer area to cover meant the effort felt thinly spread. National agencies offered technical support, but the clock was ticking, and the mountain offered no quarter. The initial surge of optimism, fueled by the belief that surely, he would be found quickly, began to recede like an ebb tide. Hope, a fragile bloom in their hearts, started to wither under the relentless sun and the chilling nights. The emotional toll was a crushing weight. Sleepless nights spent staring at maps, days filled with the deafening silence of no news, every meal a tasteless formality swallowed through a dry throat. His wife clung to his favorite worn jacket, burying her face in the fabric, trying to conjure the scent of him, the warmth of his smile. His children drew pictures of him flying high, their crayon skies holding a poignant, innocent hope that adult hearts struggled to maintain. The collective breath of the community seemed held tight in their chests, waiting for a sign, any sign, that the mountain had not claimed one of its own. But as the third day dawned, marked only by the ceaseless drone of search planes against an impossibly clear sky, the terrible truth began to settle. The immediate aftermath was over, and the long, cold waiting had truly begun, whispering promises of mysteries deeper than a simple accident. The vast, indifferent wilderness swallowed every hopeful sound. Days bled into weeks, then months, marked only by the changing hues of the distant peaks and the increasing weariness etched onto the faces of search teams. Hundreds combed the rugged terrain, forests so thick sunlight barely penetrated, canyons that echoed with false hopes, and ridges that offered only sweeping, empty vistas. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky like tireless, mournful insects, their rhythmic beat a constant, dull ache in the ears, yet spotting nothing but the endless green carpet below. The sheer scale of the search was staggering, a monument to desperation and dwindling possibility. Yet the ground, the air, the rivers yielded no wreckage, no trace, not even a single misplaced object. Whispers began to circulate, hushed debates replacing the initial confident pronouncements. Was it catastrophic mechanical failure, a sudden brutal end, or pilot error, a fatal miscalculation in unforgiving conditions? Then came the darker theories, spoken in lower tones. Foul play, sabotage, something sinister lurking beneath the surface of a presumed accident. But mostly, the wilderness itself became the prime suspect, an immense, silent entity capable of consuming anything and everything without leaving a mark. For Sarah, whose life had fractured the moment the call came, each passing day was a step further away from possibility, a heavier layer of dread pressing down. She spent hours staring at maps spread across the kitchen table, tracing hypothetical flight paths over terrain that seemed impossibly large. Feeling the cold dread pool in her stomach with every mountain peak, every deep ravine. One particularly bleak afternoon, standing at the edge of the designated search zone, she watched a small, worn teddy bear, likely dropped by a volunteer's child, lie forgotten by the roadside, its bright fur dulled by dust, a painfully mundane object in the face of such profound loss. A small, personal item lying visible and unclaimed, while the precious lives remained unseen and unattainable. The official scaled back, the command center packed away, the weary handshakes and sympathetic murmurs signifying the end. The word missing became a cruel administrative label for a gaping wound that refused to close. The lack of a crash site, a finding, anything concrete, left a terrifying void, a constant low hum of what if that was far more agonizing than any definitive answer. It felt like the earth had simply opened up and taken them whole, leaving the living trapped in a perpetual twilight of uncertainty, forced to build a life around an absence that was everywhere and nowhere. But as the search efforts faded into memory, the unsettling questions about how something so large could simply vanish began to gnaw, suggesting that perhaps the answer wasn't in the sky or the wilderness, but in something deliberately hidden. As days bled into a week and the drone of search planes faded into a haunting silence, another sound began to fill the void. Whispers. They started quietly, like the rustle of dry leaves, then grew, carried on the wind through the small town, seeping under doorways and through cracked window panes. The pilot hadn't just flown, he'd fought. His conservation work wasn't a quiet passion. It was a fierce, unyielding war against those who preyed on the wild heart of the land. He'd confiscated illegal hauls, testified against powerful figures, disrupted established networks of poaching and illicit trade. He made enemies. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The family, huddled together in a limbo of desperate hope, felt the tendrils of dread tightening around their chests. Every unfamiliar face, every averted glance in town, seemed to confirm the terrifying possibilities. The mother, stoic for days, finally broke one evening, her voice barely a whisper. What if someone did this? What if he didn't just disappear? That question, spoken aloud, was the cruel emotional climax, tearing through the fragile shield of denial they had built. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a raw, terrifying anger mixed with profound helplessness. The image of the pilot, not lost, but taken, replaced the vision of him injured but alive, pushing them into a new, darker chapter of their waiting. The familiar creak of the porch swing outside suddenly sounded sinister, like footsteps approaching in the night, and the family knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they had to understand who might have wanted him gone. The years blurred into a quiet agony, each turning calendar page of the 1990s and early 2000s a fresh wave of grief that never quite broke. The family home, once vibrant with the pilot's laughter and the scent of aviation fuel and pine, became a museum of static hope. The children grew. Their milestones, graduations, first jobs, budding relationships, celebrated with a bittersweet ache, his seat at the table perpetually empty. They learned to answer questions about him with practiced, quiet sadness. The initial frantic searching giving way to a dull, persistent ache. The scent of rain on the air, the call of a distant bird, the drone of a small plane overhead, these sensory triggers would seize Sarah, yanking her back to the last morning. The hopeful goodbye, the chilling quiet that followed. One particularly harsh winter evening, huddled by the fire, she had caught her reflection in the dark window pane, seeing not herself, but a woman defined solely by an unanswered question, a life held captive by an unresolved mystery. The weight of not knowing was a physical burden, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe, hard to fully live. Relationships frayed under the strain. Friends offered platitudes that felt hollow against the gaping void. Yet, within the conservation community, his name still resonated. Conferences dedicated segments to his pioneering aerial surveys. Younger colleagues cited his data, spoke of his passion for protecting wild spaces. But the mentions were always tinged with a somber note, his legacy inextricably linked to the baffling silence that had swallowed him whole. The grants he secured continued to fund vital work, but the pilot, the man himself, remained suspended, neither here nor gone, a ghost in the data. A heartbreaking footnote in the history of conservation. They lived in the shadow of his last flight, the unanswered questions a relentless hum beneath the surface of their forced normalcy, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. 20 years melted away, a slow tide carving new shorelines across the continent. Africa in 2011 was a tapestry far denser and more complex than the one left behind in the urgency of 1991. Conservation had embraced the digital age. Satellite imagery tracked herds with unprecedented accuracy. Anti-poaching units were better equipped. Faster communication networks spanned vast distances, yet the fundamental struggle remained fierce, a constant battle waged in remote corners. Back in the world the pilot had left, his family had learned the brutal rhythm of absence. His daughter, once a child, was a woman now, carrying the quiet ache of a life lived without knowing, without closure. His wife, her face etched with years of unanswered questions, had found a fragile peace, a garden blooming where hope had once stubbornly stood. Life had carried on, as it always does, leaving the space he occupied silent but never truly empty. High in the unforgiving heart of a previously unexplored range, a small team of climatologists, led by the stoic Dr. Lena Hansen, battled thin air and sheer rock faces. Their mission: drill ice cores, unlock ancient climate secrets. They were focused solely on the vertical world, on ice layers and rock samples, utterly detached from the human history potentially hidden beneath the permanent snowline. The mountain was a titan of granite and ice, a place that seemed to actively resist intrusion, its silence broken only by the shriek of wind and the crunch of crampons on frozen scree. Every step was a deliberate act against gravity, against the biting cold that seeped into bone. They chose this peak for its isolation, the purity of its ice undisturbed for millennia, never imagining it held more than just meteorological data. As they struggled towards a high plateau, a vast, flat expanse, unexpectedly cradled between twin peaks, the light changed, becoming almost impossibly stark against the snow. A strange stillness settled, not just of the air, but a heavier, expectant quiet. The plateau stretched out before them, desolate and improbable, a place where nothing man-made should exist. Yet something on its far edge caught the eye, a dark, unnatural shape against the blinding white. The air grew thin and sharp, slicing through their lungs with each upward step. It was a climb measured in small victories against relentless rock and wind, the peaks looming overhead, promising nothing but more struggle. Then Liam saw it, a glint, unnatural against the muted grays and browns of the mountain flank. Something snagged on a jagged outcrop hundreds of feet below the ridge they were nearing. At first, he dismissed it, a trick of light on ice, perhaps. But as they traversed, the shape resolved itself, undeniably metallic, undeniably wrong. A cold dread began to coil in his gut. They detoured down a steep, treacherous scree slope, the descent eerily quiet save for the skittering stones. The wind seemed to fall silent as they drew closer, replaced by an oppressive stillness. There it was, not just a glint, but the shattered remains of a small aircraft spread across a gully like a broken bird. Twisted aluminum lay like discarded ribbon, wires snaked from a ripped fuselage, and a wing, snapped clean, pointed accusingly at the sky. The impact site was a raw scar on the mountainside, a violent moment frozen in time, preserved by altitude and isolation. Shock rippled through the group, a shared, silent gasp. Solemnity settled heavy, a weight colder than the mountain air. This wasn't just wreckage, it was a tomb. Liam knelt beside a piece of paneling, his gloved fingers tracing faded lettering. Sarah was beside him, her breath held tight. On a corroded instrument dial, partially shielded by a rock, they found it, a serial number fragment, a manufacturer's plate. And beneath that, tucked into a warped piece of structure, a small metal box, miraculously intact, holding a pilot's license, sealed inside a heavy plastic sleeve. The faded photograph stared up at them, the name below clear despite the years. Captain Elias Thorne. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow, stealing their breath. 1991. The missing pilot. This wasn't just a tragic accident scene they'd stumbled upon. It was the answer to a decades-old question, a lost piece of history waiting in the silent high peaks. The mountain had held its secret well, but now the truth was laid bare, and its implications stretched far beyond this lonely grave. They had found him, and in doing so, opened a door to something they couldn't yet comprehend. The initial shock of finding the wreckage gave way to a grim, determined silence. They began the methodical search, their boots crunching on splintered metal and fallen branches, their breaths misting in the cold air. It was a morbid excavation, each movement careful, respectful. Unearthed crumpled maps, faded flight manuals, and amidst the chaos, personal effects that felt starkly intimate. A worn leather wallet, tucked under a twisted piece of fuselage, yielded a driver's license. A name, a face frozen in time, undeniably confirming the pilot's identity. There was a tarnished locket, a small hardbound journal with water-damaged pages. He was here. This was him. A wave of sorrow, heavy and expected, washed over them, a somber echo of the 20-year-old loss. But as they sifted through every piece of debris, as their eyes scoured the ground beneath the broken wings and around the crushed cockpit, a new, unsettling emotion began to creep in. Confusion. They found no body, no remains within the fuselage, no limbs tangled in the wreckage, no dark stains on the torn upholstery. They expanded their search, moving outwards in widening circles through the dense pine needles and ferns, calling out, listening. Only the wind answered. Then came the cockpit. Stepping carefully over bent metal struts, they peered inside. The seat was empty. The seatbelt dangled loosely, unbuckled. The control panel was a mangled mess of dials and wires, but the space where the pilot should have been was simply vacant. It wasn't the violent, abrupt vacancy left by immense force. It was an absence that felt deliberate, impossible. A sense of profound dread settled in the gut of the lead climber, deeper than any fear the treacherous ascent had inspired. How could a plane crash like this, and the pilot simply vanish? 20 years ago, everyone assumed a tragic end here, high on the unforgiving peak. But this empty seat, surrounded by confirmation of identity, didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning to a different, far more terrifying question. One that made the hairs on their arms stand on end despite the chill. Where did he go? The sharp, insistent ring of the telephone shattered the afternoon quiet in the pilot's family home. A sound that always carried a residual echo of the call that had delivered the first devastating news years ago. Mrs. Peterson, her movements slowed by time and a grief that had settled deep into her bones, reached for the receiver, her hand trembling slightly, a reflex that had never gone away. A polite, somber voice on the other end delivered the impossible. Wreckage found, confirmed as belonging to her husband's long-lost plane. For a breathless moment, the world tilted. The old, familiar ache in her chest sharpened, raw as the day it began. But beneath it, a fragile, almost unbearable flicker ignited. Hope. Hope for answers, for closure, perhaps even, but the thought was too terrifyingly beautiful to fully form. She clutched the heavy Bakelite phone tighter, her knuckles white, gazing at the framed photograph of a smiling young man in a flight suit on the mantelpiece, dust motes dancing in the sunlight around it. The authorities, notified moments before, simultaneously pulled faded files from secure archives, the thick paper smelling of dust and time. The grim, cold facts of a 22-year-old disappearance, suddenly vibrant and demanding attention once more. But the second call came swiftly, a crushing follow-up that extinguished the nascent hope like a doused flame. The cockpit was empty. The wreckage contained no remains. Nothing to suggest her husband had been inside upon impact. Confusion swirled, quickly drowning out the initial shock and hope, leaving only a profound, aching emptiness, far worse than before. If the plane was found, yet he wasn't there, where could he possibly be? The renewed pain was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The official investigation, now fully reopened, shifted its focus dramatically. The initial relief replaced by a chilling, urgent question that hung heavy in the air over both the family and the task force. What else was found at the remote crash site that could explain the impossible absence? The forest floor was slick with damp leaves, 20 years of them piled high, hiding secrets the last searchers might have walked right over. A new team arrived, a mix of seasoned state police detectives, sharp-eyed crash investigators from the NTSB, and quiet experts from the National Forest Service. Their boots crunching softly on the accumulated decay, they spread out, a grid of careful, measured steps across the overgrown debris field. Sunlight, dappled and cool, filtered through the thick canopy that had grown taller, denser since the wreckage fell. The air tasted of pine, moss, and something metallic and old, a faint echo of the violence that had scarred this place 2 decades prior. It was a cold case, frozen not just by time, but by the wilderness itself, which had worked tirelessly to bury the evidence under roots and soil. Each investigator carried the weight of that truth, the near impossibility of finding anything significant after so long. A detective knelt beside a twisted piece of aluminum, running a gloved hand over the rust and lichen that had bloomed on its surface. What stresses were etched into this metal? What could it still tell them about the final horrifying moments? A crash investigator meticulously photographed debris tagged during the initial, less sophisticated search, comparing notes against faded, 20-year-old reports. The scale of the task felt overwhelming. Fragments were scattered over a vast area, many likely sunk deep into the earth. Back in temporary offices miles away, others were already pulling dusty case files, preparing to re-interview witnesses whose memories might have blurred, changed, or solidified into inaccurate narratives over 2 decades. The sheer silence of the site, broken only by the distant call of a bird, felt heavy with the past, a quiet resistance to their efforts. It wasn't just a lack of new clues that hindered them. It was the constant gnawing knowledge that crucial details had probably vanished forever, claimed by the elements. Yet, as one of the conservation officials pointed out a peculiar growth pattern on a tree adjacent to a large piece of fuselage, something subtly different from the surrounding flora. A ripple of focused attention passed through the team. It was a tiny detail, easily missed, but in a cold case, every anomaly felt like a potential thread, potentially leading somewhere unexpected. The air in the archives hung thick with the scent of aging paper and settled dust, a smell Elias had come to associate with forgotten stories. He sat hunched over cardboard boxes, the weight of 2 decades pressing down from the stacks surrounding him. The original report had called it pilot error, plain and simple, a tragic misjudgment in bad weather. Everyone had moved on. But something in the faded photographs from the crash site bothered him. A jagged tear in a piece of wing fabric, too clean for impact, caught his eye in one image. A detail easily dismissed then as just part of the destruction, but now, under closer scrutiny, it felt wrong. He pushed that thought aside momentarily, sifting through financial records and maintenance logs that felt frustratingly incomplete. The pilot, Robert Vance, had been meticulous. These gaps didn't fit the man described by old colleagues. It was in a separate, mislabeled box, tucked away on a high shelf, that he found the personal effects the family had turned over. Among a worn leather wallet and a folded map, he found a small, tarnished silver compass, its glass cracked, but the needle still pointing north. It looked like something a child would cherish. A wave of unexpected sorrow washed over him, connecting him to the absent pilot more than any official document could. Then beneath it, a bundle of letters tied with twine. Not fan mail or friendly notes. These were hostile, filled with vitriol, clearly agitated by Vance's conservation efforts, specific projects blocking development, protecting sensitive land. They didn't just want to stop you, Elias thought, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. They wanted you gone. His heart hammered against his ribs, the quiet archive suddenly feeling charged with dormant malice. One name appeared repeatedly, scrawled in angry, looping script at the end of several letters. It was a name tied to the very development projects Vance had opposed. The dust motes dancing in the sliver of sunlight filtering through a high window seemed to swirl faster, reflecting the sudden urgency pulsing through him. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, and the man who wrote those letters might know why. He sifted through the box again, the smell of faded paper and dust tickling his nose, a scent that always pulled him back to the quiet desperation of the case files. Years had passed since the pilot vanished, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Everyone called it a likely crash, lost somewhere in the unforgiving terrain, another statistic in the ledger of forgotten lives. Yet, a nagging detail always snagged in his mind. A discrepancy in the pilot's last recorded heading, veering subtly off the intended flight path just before contact was lost. It wasn't enough to build a case, not against the overwhelming evidence of a likely mechanical failure or navigational error. But the thread remained, fine as a spider silk, stubbornly refusing to break. This time, his fingers brushed against a loose page tucked deep within the pilot's logbook. A page marked with hurried scribbles, diagrams that looked like survey routes, and a single ominous phrase underlined multiple times: Silent River Extraction. He hadn't seen this note before, buried beneath stacks of routine flight logs. The phrase pulsed with a strange energy, suddenly connecting to whispers he'd heard years ago about illicit logging operations in restricted zones, whispers that had never materialized into concrete leads. He tracked down an old man, a former ranger known for keeping his ears open, living now in a small cabin that smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. The man's eyes, rheumy and wary, held a flicker of recognition when the name of the pilot was spoken. And a shadow crossed his face at Silent River Extraction. He was asking questions, the old man rasped, his voice rough like sandpaper. Lots of questions about what wasn't supposed to be happening up there. They don't like questions, those folks. Run things quiet. Very quiet. The air in the small room grew heavy, charged with unspoken fear. A chill, sharper than the mountain wind outside, snaked down Alex's spine. It hit him then, with the force of a physical blow. The pilot hadn't just gotten lost. He had stumbled onto something. Onto them. The deviation wasn't an error. It was a purposeful flight, an investigation cut brutally short. The missing person case evaporated, replaced by the chilling certainty of murder. The knowledge settled heavy in his gut, a cold knot of dread mixed with a fierce, protective anger for the pilot whose curiosity had cost him everything. He knew now that the path ahead was no longer about searching, but about hunting. The air in the small office grew thick with dread as the investigator laid out the timeline, fragments of evidence finally interlocking like shattered glass pieces, forming a gruesome mosaic. Sarah stared at the aerial photographs spread across the table, the red circles marking potential ground sightings, her heart hammering against her ribs. They spoke of shadows moving where no shadows should be, of hurried activity near the makeshift landing site, piecing together a story far uglier than a simple mechanical failure. It wasn't just a crash, it felt intentional. The chilling scenario spun in her mind. Had her father spotted something he wasn't meant to see from the cockpit? Something hidden deep in the wilderness below? Had someone or something forced him down? Or worse, had he been deliberately targeted, his vital mission somehow intersecting with a dark secret buried beneath the tree line? Each possibility twisted the knife deeper, replacing the familiar ache of loss with a searing, visceral pain. The realization that his final moments might have been filled with terror, not just the struggle against malfunctioning machinery, stole her breath. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, the dry scent of old paper and stale coffee doing little to ground her in the moment. Tears burned in her eyes, unshed, replaced by a fierce, cold resolve. The grief was immense, a suffocating blanket, yet beneath it pulsed a furious, burning anger. They hadn't just taken her father. They had silenced a voice, perhaps stolen the very information he died trying to protect. The memory of his unwavering belief in his work, his quiet determination to make a difference, fueled her defiance. Justice wasn't just a word anymore. It was a path she had to walk, no matter how painful. A debt that had to be paid for the truth they tried to bury with him. The investigator cleared his throat, pulling her back from the edge of her internal turmoil. "We have a few individuals of interest," he said softly, gesturing towards a separate folder, its contents hinting at the shapes now emerging from the shadows of the past. The dusty light filtering through the barn's single-high window caught the motes dancing in the air, illuminating the scene like a stage. Decades had passed, dust settling layer upon layer, yet the air here felt charged, thick with secrets held too long. He stood across from them, the two figures who had lived under the weight of their lie, etched into the weary lines on their faces. The air hung heavy, silent, except for the distant caw of a crow, a stark contrast to the hurricane of emotion raging inside him. The pieces, gathered over years of relentless searching, clicked into place with a sickening finality. Their eyes, evasive and guarded, finally met his, and in that fraction of a second, the truth was laid bare, not through words, but through the crushing weight of their shared silence. He saw the flicker of desperation, the ghost of a long-buried decision made in panic. The crash wasn't survivable for the pilot, they confessed, their voices barely a whisper now. They had found the wreck, found him, but the fear of being linked to the accident, the fear of the consequences in their isolated community, had driven their unthinkable act. They hadn't taken the body, they had simply left it, exposed to the elements and the hungry wild, a brutal act of abandonment, intended to erase any trace of their discovery. The shock ripped through him, colder and sharper than any mountain wind. Not malice leading to disappearance, but cowardice leading to abandonment and decay. The missing body wasn't a puzzle piece moved by a calculating hand, but one left behind by terrified ones, hoping nature would complete their grim cover-up. A single tear tracked a clean line through the dust on his cheek. It wasn't the capture, but this quiet, devastating confession, this unraveling of the why behind the empty grave that marked the true climax. It was the moment the ghost finally found its rest, the decades of haunting silence broken by the raw, painful sound of truth. The authorities, waiting outside, moved in then, the metallic click of restraints echoing the finality of the reveal. The air shifted again, from heavy anticipation to the stark reality of consequences, leaving him standing amidst the settled dust and the wreckage of a hidden past, wondering what comes next after justice is served. But the scars remain. The world outside erupted, a cacophony of headlines and pronouncements that felt both distant and deafening. For years, only whispers filled the spaces where answers should have been. But now, the truth, stark and brutal, echoed across the news wires. Sarah watched from a quiet corner, the faces of the victims' families raw on the screen. Tears streamed, yes, but interspersed with gasps of released tension. Guttural sobs, shaking years of pent-up anguish from their bodies. There was no joy, not really, just the devastating relief of knowing. She felt the ripple of their collective grief like a physical wave, a heavy blanket settling over the town that had held its breath for so long. The conservation land, once just a backdrop to the mystery, was now a tainted symbol, the revelation exposing not just a monstrous act, but layers of corruption and negligence that had allowed it to happen. Support for genuine preservation efforts surged in some corners, fueled by outrage, while others recoiled. The very soil, now feeling cursed, standing under the gray sky, the damp air heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth, Sarah felt the profound, aching emptiness that closure brought. It wasn't a healing balm. It was the quiet after a storm. The landscape forever changed, revealing scars the darkness had hidden. A single tear tracked a slow path down her cheek, not just for the lost, but for the innocence stolen from this place and from the futures that would never be. The path ahead felt uncertain, weighted by the ghosts the truth had finally given name to, yet cleared, somehow, of the suffocating fog of the unknown. Years drifted like fallen leaves after his final flight, yet the echo of his engine, once a familiar comfort across the vast wilderness, now resonated with a different kind of power. The pilot, lost but never forgotten, had not just vanished. He had, in a profound and unexpected way, taken wing. His quiet dedication, the countless hours spent documenting the plight of the shrinking herds from the air, the passionate appeals he had made before his last fateful journey. These seeds he'd sown had not died with him. Instead, watered by the shock of his disappearance and the stark reality his absence highlighted, they bloomed into a powerful movement. Whispers of his sacrifice galvanized local communities and conservation groups alike. They spoke his name in hushed tones of reverence, recounting his unwavering belief in the intrinsic right of the wild creatures to thrive. His hand-drawn maps, recovered from his cabin alongside meticulous notes on poaching patterns, became crucial evidence, cold facts presented with the weight of personal tragedy. Pressure mounted on authorities, the pilot's story, amplified by grieving friends and family who refused to let his work fade, became a national headline. Donations poured in, specifically earmarked for aerial patrols and stricter anti-poaching measures, the very things he had tirelessly advocated for. Policymakers, initially hesitant, found it increasingly difficult to ignore the emotional plea tied to a fallen hero. New legislation, drafted in the wake of his disappearance, bore his silent imprint. Mandates for increased wildlife corridor protection and harsher penalties for environmental crimes finally passed into law. His family, their grief a heavy cloak for so long, slowly began to find solace not in forgetting, but in witnessing the tangible change his life and death had wrought. They visited the newly established ranger station, funded in part by the legacy campaign named in his honor, and saw the dedicated teams preparing for flights over the protected lands. His daughter traced the faded photograph of him, smiling beside his plane, feeling a surge of pride mixed with the lingering ache of loss. The vast, open sky, once a source of dread, now felt like a testament to his freedom and the enduring spirit of the wild he had loved. It was a slow, arduous fight, this battle for the wilderness, but standing there, feeling the crisp wind on their faces and hearing the distant call of a solitary bird, they knew his contribution was indelible. Justice, in the form of protected lands and safer skies for the creatures below, had a long arc, and he had pulled it forward with his final unintended flight. His was a legacy measured not in years, but in the silent return of wildlife to once empty plains, a testament that even in loss, purpose could soar.